From the debut of Metal Gear Solid in 1998, this tactical espionage action series has made it clear that, in the words of its own creator Hideo Kojima, it sets out to question the dominance of America on the world stage. And that dominance, of course, traces back to the Second World War. What few in the West have understood over the years is that Hideo Kojima is a pacifist. And as much as his franchise serves to criticize the US, it contains nearly as much commentary on the era of Japanese fascism and totalitarianism that led to World War II. Here's a video on how. Metal Gear Solid 1 takes place on Shadow Moses Island in the Aleutian Archipelago off the coast of Alaska. Now, as I've covered in a previous video, the Aleutians themselves were a battlefield during the war. But the way Shadow Moses Island is written strongly resembles a World War II era island closer to home, Okunoshima. It was on Okunoshima, a small island near Hiroshima, that the Empire of Japan secretly built a plant for large-scale production of poison gas. It was so secret, in fact, that officially from 1938 to 1947, it didn't exist on any map. In MGS1, Metal Gear Rex is the byproduct of defense contractor consolidation and a post-Cold War integration that really did happen in the United States between the public and private sectors. This, in turn, though, strongly resembles how Japanese industries were tilted towards meeting military demands. There was even the same march towards state-directed consolidation in Japan in the form of the so-called Zaibatsu system, referring to massive, privately owned conglomerates that served the state. We got another direct allusion in 2001's Metal Gear Solid 2 Sons of Liberty when it came to the secret government facility masquerading as a water purification plant, the Big Shell. One of the most infamous and secretive Imperial outfits of all was Japan's bioweapon division, Unit 731. The unit's base of operations, a plant built inside occupied Chinese territory, was, along with the unit itself, officially given the purpose of water purification. Even the existence of Unit 731 has never been officially acknowledged, due to the politically, not to mention ethically and morally, sensitive nature of their operations. What actually went on there is probably too horrible to mention here, but suffice to say, much of the scientific hubris and amorality that MGS at large criticizes was on full display. One of the reasons no one was prosecuted from the unit after the war was that most of the research wound up in American hands. MGS3, meanwhile, took players to what was only billed as Soviet territory at the height of the Cold War. In truth, the jungle setting more resembled the island jungle battlefields of certain World War II-era islands. The main real-life basis for Selenoyarsk, Yakushima Island, for example, was occupied by US forces from 1945 to 1953. It was actually here where the B-29 that dropped the atomic bomb on Nagasaki briefly stopped before heading inland. Defending the home territory of Japan was one of the goals that pushed its people to embrace completely the very totalitarian fascists who got them into this mess in the first place. The hero worship that we see in all the Metal Gear games, including MGS3, over characters like the boss, harken back to the propagandistic way that the Empire would transform certain soldiers into war gods as symbols for public consumption. And yet again, like the boss, these incredibly skilled patriots were eaten up and spitten out by the very government in whose name they largely died. And another major element that MGS has frequently referenced about the era of Japanese totalitarianism is the use of child soldiers, an issue that was perhaps first raised by Metal Gear 2 Solid Snake. As a result of the militarization of the entire society and the rapid approach of Allied forces towards the home islands of Japan, schoolchildren were forced to dig foxholes and were sometimes shot at by American planes. Young boys were drafted into the military, and everyone was expected to live and die as the so-called limbs of the Emperor, an interesting phrase for a much later game in the series, The Phantom Pain. Nowhere is the nature of Japanese fascist totalitarianism made more manifest than in Metal Gear Solid 4. In that game, war, we see, has permeated every facet of society under the so-called war economy, and strict censorship prevents dissent not only from being expressed, but even from being thought. And that brings up a major influence on not only MGS4, but also the Phantom Pain, that also gets overlooked as an implicit depiction of World War II-era Japan, George Orwell's novel 1984. Though, like MGS, 1984 creates its setting as a fusion between multiple strands of modern oppression, few in the West realized that, during the war, in Japan, the thought police were no metaphor, they were real, and they even went by that name. This link to Orwell's classic of dystopian, speculative fiction was only made more explicit by the final numbered MGS game, The Phantom Pain. The Emperor was said to be an immortal god, and in The Phantom Pain, that immortality in the form of Big Boss becoming his own mental copy Venom Snake is made real. And of course, we can also compare this to how Big Boss was cloned in earlier games to become characters like Solid Snake and Liquid Snake. The Imperial Japanese were would-be colonizers, and all of the Phantom Pain takes place in one colonial territory or another. The way Japan presented itself to the states that it desired to conquer, like China, Korea, and modern-day Vietnam, was as a big brother, one who would liberate Asia for the Asians. Yet perhaps due in no small part to the influence of Nazi Germany, the Japanese Empire was immensely racist. They believed that their so-called Yamato spirit and Yamato race made them genetically superior super soldiers, second only perhaps to whites, who at any rate they suspected, due to our preponderance of body hair and larger height, to be, if not in some ways racially superior, in other ways less evolved. One of the central words repeated in the Phantom Pain, thematically, is demon. It was the same word that the fascists in Japan used to literally demonize the West. Like the slogans that fill Mother Base near the end of the game, and in turn the slogans from Orwell's book, Imperial Japan was full of such political language meant to police, quite literally, people's thoughts. After the war, Japan became a bastion for pacifism, and no game in the series, as I briefly touched on, dealt with this legacy more directly than Metal Gear Solid Peace Walker. In Metal Gear Solid Peace Walker, we learn about Japan's post-war peace constitution, which formally renounced war and gave the world a model for how to approach building a future free from the scourge of nuclear weapons. Peace Walker dealt generally with the legacy of Japanese fascism and the lingering effects of World War II as embodied in the Cold War. Though the game takes place in the Caribbean, the setting of Peace Walker also resembles islands in the Pacific. This enduring legacy of the war is something that Peace Walker shared in common with MGS3. But Peace Walker taught players about the sorry state of Japan after the war, when many women had to become prostitutes and people starved by the thousands. The character Kazuhira Miller was born from those times, and for a while he even worked as a member of the post-war Japanese outfit, the JSDF, or Japanese Self-Defense Force. Of course, the JSDF is a military in all but name. Could this peace, represented not only by Japan's abolished army and the 1970s era of nuclear détente, actually be merely the illusion of peace? This central question, posed by Peace Walker itself, goes all the way back to World War II, ironically, when Japan initially played the role of peacekeeper to cover up what was actually a naked war of aggression and imperial expansion against China that Japan started. One illustration for how World War II in Japan began as an illusion of peace is how, for the generation that survived it, no official name for the conflict was ever chosen. To quote Japan at War in oral history, some called it the Pacific War, the Greater East Asia War, the China Incident, the Japan-China War, or the 15-Year War, such as the power of words that the Phantom Pain, in turn, would describe. Snake's bandana over the years has always resembled, little did we realize in the West, the Japanese hachimaki, helmet scarf. Though not exclusive to World War II, these symbolic bands adorn the heads of kamikaze pilots during their suicide missions. It's no coincidence that the final game in the series, Metal Gear Solid V: The Phantom Pain, contained a line about weapons learning to walk upright. The game was explicitly linking the fanaticism of World War II era Japanese totalitarian fascists with that of modern-day Islamic extremist jihadists. Note, as a case in point, that the dominant color scheme of the game is red and white. During the war, as John Dower explains in War Without Mercy, both colors were deeply symbolic and meaningful for the Japanese. Due to the, quote, visual richness of written Japanese, to read the character for sincerity involves literally also seeing an ideograph meaning red and intimating blood, end quote. Dower quotes from a World War II era piece titled Establishing a Japanese Racial Worldview that argues, due to customs from the Shinto religion, white as purity and red as blood combine to become, in the Japanese fascist imagination, the pink shade of the single most symbolic token in the Japanese tradition, the sakura, or cherry blossom. To quote Dower one last time, neither the Stars and Stripes nor the Union Jack can be said to really tap the depths of subliminal symbolism that is present in Japan's national emblems. The young pilots about to embark on suicide missions during the final year of the war live vividly in the mind's eye, wearing white headbands with the rising sun emblem. And like countless other civilian and military patriots, the kamikaze pilots were intimately associated with the cherry blossom. The nationalism of the rising sun flag and the graceful falling of the cherry blossoms are fairly straightforward, but to many in the West, the color connotations of the symbols, the whiteness of purity and redness of both blood and sincerity, may not have been so readily apparent, end quote. In the end, hopefully I've made clear, MGS is more than just a game series with an anti-American bent. Rather, it is anti-war, full stop, and in turn anti-war mongers. As Peace Walker teaches us, peace isn't something easily obtained. We may never even see it in our or anyone's lifetime. But if MGS as a whole has one thing to pass on, it seems to be the importance to follow your heart even if it's ultimately a lost cause. Total peace may be impossible, but that doesn't mean we should ever give up. We can change the world and make it a less violent, brutal, and deadly place for the coming generations. But doing so ultimately means rejecting the mind control and groupthink of all fascisms and totalitarianisms, maybe even most ideologies, and daring to figure things out peacefully for ourselves. Until next time, boss.